Dr. Trivedi was supposed to be here, he couldn't join, so that's how I get to do 2 talks about the work that we've been doing. And again, it's a very broad topic within the context of the NIDA Clinical Trials Network that I talked about earlier in the morning or earlier in the day. And again, I'm not going to present any NIDA Clinical Trials Network data per se. I do have one slide this time with some data. I wanted to frame my talk, which seeming the last individual presentation, by just borrowing this slide from NIDA website. And just over a short period of less than a decade, 5-6 years, we have seen that overdose deaths that involve stimulants, so either cocaine or methamphetamine, have increased by 4 to 5-fold, right? So just, I'll let that sink in, because if this was other conditions, we would have congressional hearings, we would have issues, and we would have all sorts of different treatment strategies that we would be devising for an illness for which we do not have any FDA-approved medication or clear device. So it really is. I do sometimes carry the zeal of the new convert. Like, I spent over a decade talking about depression and how we need better treatments, but we have 40 plus antidepressant medications, right? So this is really an important underserved area of need that we need to talk about more often. Then, as I was doing this, one of my med students wanted to do a project with me, and she came and talked about how, like, she saw this paper that had come out earlier this year about prescription for stimulants going up in the United States. So that was, I think, a February JAMA Psychiatry paper that in general, ADHD medications are being prescribed more often, stimulants are being prescribed more often. So we looked at the data from NSDUH. So this is just prevalence in 2020. Again, the way NSDUH reports data, it changed from 2019 to 2020. Again, 2020 is an important watershed because of the COVID pandemic. But if you look at the prevalence rates in 2020 and compare 2021 or 2022, what's very clear is that this is the past 12 months if they met criteria for prescription stimulant use disorder. So this is not whether they use prescription stimulants or not. This is not whether they misused it. This is the criteria for prescription stimulant use disorder. And we see that across the board, there is a 2 to 5-fold increase in the prevalence rate of prescription stimulant use disorder. So in terms of illnesses that may be under our radar, this could be one of those things. Again, we'll look at the 2023 NSDUH data to see if this really is a pattern or this was a blip on our radar related to how we were adjusting to the life and pandemic. But we are seeing that this is an important, and again, we have to keep in mind that this is how some of the opioid crisis started also. So starting with prescription, moving on to other drugs of use. So that's an important concept. I already talked about this adaptive study that was the injectable naltrexone plus oral sustained release bupropion. I think this has been really informative to the field. I have colleagues in New Mexico who say that Medicaid there covers this treatment for prescription methamphetamine use disorder, as prescription for treatment of methamphetamine use disorder, and that just reflects the burden of the disorder in populations. But I also, so highly informative, practice-changing paper, but if you look at the average response rate, and response again is 3 out of 4 negative urine sample over a 2-week period of time, it's only 13.6%, right? So again, the placebo rate is really low, but our treatment is working in fewer than 1 in 6 people. So we really need better treatments. And so that really underscores the need for treatments. So I went a bit broadly than neuromodulation and just talked about interventional approaches. And again, this is coming from treatment-resistant depression work, where we now think of interventional psychiatry. Our practice at UT Southwestern, the ECT team also does TMS and also does intranasal esketamine. So this is again thinking in terms of clinical practice. So we have a lot of different interventions. So I was a little bit disheartened that the combination therapeutics UO1 is not including medications, it's neurostimulation behavioral treatments. What about some other medication treatments? So we have racemic ketamine, which we published last year, as part of the LEGD trial is as good as ECT in people with depression. We have vagus nerve stimulation, which had a large ongoing clinical trial, but we also have therapeutic pipelines. So one thing that we haven't probably focused as much attention is focused ultrasound, which high intensity focused ultrasound is clinically used for treatment of movement disorders. So what can we learn from other fields that we can apply here? Psychedelics have a lot of interest, but I'm not going to go there. So the main study that I'll tell you a minute about is the transcranial magnetic stimulation for treatment of methamphetamine or cocaine use disorder. If you have forgotten my presentation from earlier in the morning, the primary outcome here was whether 75% of the treatments were done. So that is the primary outcome, whether we can actually do it or not. This is really important because we are doing these studies in places where public transportation is not available, and we are not paying people when I do my clinical trials with ketamine, I have arranged Lyft Health Ride. They get picked up from home and brought over to us. My coordinators tell me it's actually going to be much more difficult for my meth use disorder because people who take part, they do not have fixed home addresses, right? So how are you going to arrange a Lyft Health Ride for? They would prefer to just come over to our center and then we transport them over for infusions and things like that. So this was 129 people. We at UT Southwestern were one of the 4 sites. So that was, again, a personal lesson for me, that when I run a study of depression or treatment-resistant depression, if I recruit 1 to 2 people a month, I feel like it was a productive month. For this trial, we were averaging 5 to 7 people a month. And we could have done more if we had one more TLS machine, but we would max out the capacity of the business hours and how much we can fit in a machine. But the other important thing is that the database lock is going to happen next month, so we'll have outcomes from this study in a few months. But the key safety measure, seizures, I know this because we were reviewing SAEs that happen all the time, irrespective there was no seizure at all in the trial. So with 129 people, I think with a less prevalent outcome like seizure, I think we have some power to say that we didn't see any. So safety was an important consideration. So as we were doing this study, the Clinical Trials Network leadership wanted us to organize a work group on what are the treatments for stimulant use disorder. And there were 2 half days, there were 4 broad groups, but I just have the agenda from that presentation that we spent over like a quarter of that time just talking about neuromodulation. And that was around the study that we led, but also accelerated protocols. So Nolan talked about the TNS protocol. We also had presentation on focused ultrasound, photobiomodulation that is being studied in depression. So just thinking in terms of not just TMS or TDCS, I guess we were remiss in not including that, but we really wanted to focus on neuromodulation as a group. And we started thinking about that. So as I was organizing that, I was thinking maybe we should do something right away as preliminary data. So key things are now the SAINT protocol in depression is that you do 10 minutes long theta bursts, and you have a 15-minute gap. So within 5 days, 10 sessions a day, you can get 90,000 stimulations delivered, right? So if we want to do that with people with stimulant use disorder, what do we do? I don't have to do a feasibility trial to know that patients will not stay for 10 hours, right? Like that's just not going to happen, right? So even for that 50-minute break is pretty difficult because to have them come back within 15 minutes, it could be an hour and a half unless you're keeping them entertained. So we decided to, the other thing was, came up is biomarker, right? So how do we target biomarker? As we were doing this, our university moved us 2 miles off campus. So now to get an MRI scan is half a day work, right? So we went with, and we had researchers in our group who have just used resting state EEG to get the cortical conductivity. So for functional cortical conductivity using just resting state EEG. So this is a study we started last month. This is just by using our internal funding or using the accelerated TMS protocol from SAINT. So we are basically applying the SAINT protocol. And we are doing it, but just 4 treatments a day. And that was not because we thought there was like a magical number to 4, but with 4 treatments a day, we can have 2 patients coming in for treatment every day with just a machine. So that's what, and the additional thing that we layered on top of this is that every day of treatment starts with resting EEG. So we acquire 10 minutes of resting EEG. We do the first TMS session with the EEG cap on, and then we acquire 10 more minutes of resting EEG. So we are doing these serial EEGs. We have 2 people in right now. The first person did 47 out of 50 session. The second person is 34 out of 50, is on target to meet the 50 out of 50 treatment session. So we'll know probably in 6 months how the feasibility of this is going to be. So with this, I'll wrap up my presentation. That I think hopefully the urgency that I personally feel in the need for developing newer treatments for stimulant use disorder is there. We are doing a lot of clinical trials. In addition to the CTN, we are doing other clinical trials also of individuals with stimulant use disorder. I think that I think scared is the right word. Personally, I feel about prescription stimulant use disorder because it may be such a thing that things that work for getting a 40-year-old to do a clinical trial may not work with an 18-year-old to do clinical trial. So we may have to do more at home and other kind of strategies to build upon that. I think the Clinical Trials Network I have been converted is an amazing platform to do large-scale multi-site clinical trials. But the unmet need is that how do we get these interventional treatment to people who most need it? And I say this because I practice in an academic setting where we can only see patients in my practice who have insurance. Texas has 25% uninsured rate. So people who take part in clinical trials with us cannot actually get clinical care with us. So that is a major unmet need that I personally feel in my practice. So with that, I'll wrap up. And these are my acknowledgements. And thank you, everyone. Thank you for your attention.